Good morning, everyone. I see the numbers slowing down a little bit, so I think we'll start to get our Society Sunday lecture event started. So it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to our third annual Society Sunday lecture. My name is Sabrina Higgins, and I'm the Vice President for Societies for the Archaeological Institute of America. We are pleased to welcome a record number of you this year to this lecture. This event began in 2021 during the height of the pandemic, when, of course, we were forced to pivot all of our programming for the AIA to online platforms. So in previous years, we were able to celebrate all of the achievements of our local societies in person at the Society Breakfast at the annual meeting of the AIA. But of course, the pandemic prevented us from doing so in 2021. As a result, we created this event to thank our societies for their incredible ability to adapt to the changing nature of the lecture program during this time, and to create a venue where we could celebrate their successes. In the intervening years, Society Sunday has become a staple to the broader AIA program, and we are thrilled to continue this tradition and honor all of your hard work by continuing to offer this lecture, even though we hosted our first hybrid annual meeting since the pandemic. So today, we honor our 100 plus societies and all of the work that you put into sharing your love of archaeology with the broader public. And for those of you joining us for the first time, or those of you who are not yet affiliated with the local society, we encourage you to become a member, to get involved with the local society, and to take advantage of all the benefits that the AIA has to offer and membership an organization has to offer. For more information on how to join the AIA, please see the link posted in the chat function in the Zoom meeting. And it's now my pleasure to introduce the new president of the AIA, Liz Green.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Green, the current president of the AIA, and it's my pleasure to join Sabrina in welcoming you all to Society Sunday. I'm so grateful to Sabrina for organizing all of this, as well as Meredith and Sarah and the full AIA staff for their support in putting this together, and also especially Elizabeth Murphy for agreeing to join us for this incredible talk and to share her wisdom. This event brings together our society members from around North America and, based on the chat, from well beyond that, and in many ways forms the perfect encapsulation of the AIA's mission to excavate, to advocate, and to educate. As an organization, we support archaeologists and their work in the field, in the lab, in the museum. We advocate for the protection of heritage around the globe and the excavation of heritage that allows us to tell stories. And we explain the meaning of these stories of the past to people in the present and preserve them for the future. So Society Sunday allows us to share these stories with a broad public while bringing together our members on this virtual platform. We hope, though, that your local communities are similarly thriving and provide a chance for you to find and engage with the archaeologists and the archaeology of your own local communities. So if you're not already a member of the AIA, I really do urge you to become members, to join our broad, big community and our local communities as we work together to fulfill our mission. So thank you, Sabrina, for giving me the chance to introduce myself and welcome everyone here.
Thanks, Liz. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, just a couple of things to note. So I'd like to note that today's lecture is available in American Sign Language with interpretation provided by trailblazing interpreters. And due to Zoom's limitations on mobile devices and tablets, participants interested in accessing ASL interpretation should log on from the desktop version of Zoom. We will also enable auto captioning on Zoom for this lecture. One other thing to note is that if you have any questions for the speaker at the end of her lecture, please make sure to put them in the Q&A function, and we will moderate those at the end of her lecture. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Murphy, Assistant Professor of Roman Archaeology in the Department of Classics at Florida State University. Dr. Murphy is an archaeologist specializing in the study of the Mediterranean during the Roman imperial and late antique periods. Her research and teaching concern the social and economic organization of the Roman world. More specifically, her work focuses on the history and archaeology of labor, production, and technology. She is a specialist in material culture studies with particular emphasis on the artifactual record of craft production, and her fieldwork projects have spanned the ancient Mediterranean world from Asia Minor to Italy. She currently co-directs the Landscape Archaeology of Southwest Sardinia project, a diachronic landscape project in the modern region of Sulcis. With Lease, she is investigating the ancient settlement organization, landscape exploitation, and daily life practices of this rural region during the period of the Roman Empire. And today, we're very fortunate that she'll be taking us through an investigation of the everyday working lives of ancient craftspeople by venturing into the workshops of a single common profession, that is potters. Now, without any further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Elizabeth Murphy.
Thank you, Sabrina. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? If I can share there. And can everyone see my slide then? Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to join us. I would also like to thank the AIA and all of its staff for the invitation to present here today. It's an absolute privilege to talk to so many of you about my research. And what I'll be discussing today represents several kind of snippets of a larger book project that I'm finishing on Roman and late antique potters in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in this sense, my intention today is really to invite you into the world of Roman workers, but through the published evidence we have of a particular profession, and that profession being potters, particularly potters living in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. So when invited to present here today, I first wondered whether the archaeology of work might be too mundane a topic to present on such a grand public occasion. However, the mundaneness of the topic of work is precisely what makes it such an important entry point to talk about everyday people and their lives in the ancient world. Oops, let's see. Ooh, there we go. Now, we know from our modern experience that daily work routines frame and structure our everyday lives. And as we will see, they did so in antiquity as well. Work activities offer a means for subsistence, yes, almost by definition, but they also provide important social relationships, which are experienced through shared practices. Although not as scenic nor as dangerous as the iconic work environment of these gentlemen, my work setting nonetheless is also constructed around socialized work relations and embedded in a material world of work in ways that may be more familiar to some of us. How I behave and interact with my colleagues, my dean, my students are informed by sets of learned practices, who I eat lunch with, where my office is located, and the orientation of seats and stage in my lecture hall. All these materially and spatially reflect sets of cultural expectations regarding the work environment and my role in a wider work community. These sets of interactions are structured by society and work cultures. Thus, work offers a means to ground what are really rather grand and abstract concepts like economy, society, and culture. And this is what the anthropologist Herbert Applebaum meant when he wrote, "Work is like the spine which structures the way people live, how they make contact with material and social reality, and how they achieve status and self-esteem." As anthropologists, we're interested in work because of what it tells us about the rest of society, based on the viewpoint that basic institutions touch all institutions. I love that quote. So our objective today is to look at these ancient workplaces to understand what social lives and work practices look like in Roman times. So turning to the Roman world, what can we say about the nature of work and society? Well, there are numerous professions of craftspeople and tradespeople known from the Roman world. In fact, the historian Kai Ruffing has identified no fewer than 160 different terms for crafts and trades from the written evidence of the city of Rome alone. We also have individual presentations of work in the form of funerary monuments. In these cases, images of work activities appear on tombstones, tying the deceased to their profession for eternity and for community remembrance. Likewise, tools are sometimes represented, offering detailed depictions of items used in performing work tasks. But they are also here symbols of profession, and presumably by extension, meaningful associations with personal identity and social status. Now, many of these crafts and tradespeople lived in small villages, in their houses, or on rural villas. The presence of crafts and tradespeople, however, is probably most clearly seen in the small shops lining the streets of so many Roman cities, like this famous example from Ephesus, and where the collective presence of a trade is sometimes referenced by the names of streets. In these towns, they might also be members of professional associations, which have sometimes, but not uncritically, been compared to later medieval guilds. And these voluntary associations appear really in cities across the Roman world. While such associations might play different roles in different communities, many seem to have provided a sort of social club with feasts and drinking events, while providing venues, of course, to develop political and business networks. They might also observe funerary rites for deceased members or take part in civic festivals. Thus, the social lives of crafts and tradespeople could extend well beyond the workplace. So potters are only one of many dozens of professions known for the Roman world. And with so many professions and crafts, why should we dedicate an entire lecture to them, an entire talk to them? Well, potters are worth a closer evaluation for several reasons. For example, looking at local tax documents recorded on Egyptian papyri, the historian Kai Ruffing has identified potters as one of the professions that was typical of local village and town economies. They appear alongside the bakers, the weavers, tailors, and builders of town. So in this sense, they're a wonderfully ordinary profession. And given that clays are widely available, potters were common in local communities all around the Mediterranean world. Furthermore, some potters own their own workshops, and some even establish branch workshops in different provinces, quasi-ancient entrepreneurs. However, most potters and ceramicists have been characterized as being on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. In general, potters and ceramicists are not the professions where great fortunes are thought to have been made, at least not for most everyday workers. And in rural contexts in Egypt, where we have occasionally more detailed papyrus documents, Philip Meyerson has noted the presence of potter slaves and free potters who received wages that he describes as being, quote, comparable to, quote, slave labor. So potters were skilled workers, and many also represent relatively modest occupations of the Roman world. And while the extent to which they should all be, understood as some sort of, quote, working poor is and should be debated, their workshops offer nonetheless important views on the lives of everyday craft workers. Moreover, the products of their labor, pottery vessels and ceramic objects, were consumed in great quantity in the Roman period. And as a consequence, they remain ubiquitous in the archaeological record. Changes in the styles of these products can be traced through time and used to date archaeological contexts. This means that they have a particular research value in the field of archaeology more widely, and their products are just extremely well studied when compared to the goods of other crafts professions. Another reason that this craft is of interest is that ceramic manufacturing was also diverse. It was diverse in terms of the products that were being made and the segments of economy that were being supplied. So ceramic production of the Roman period not only manufactured cooking pots and table plates, but also many different types of building materials, like bricks and roof tiles and water pipes, transport containers called amphorae, storage containers called dolia, and small household implements like oil lamps for lighting. Essentially, many goods that today are manufactured in plastics and cheap glass or metals were often rendered in ceramic, and sometimes even together in the same workshops. So Roman ceramicists contributed to what today we would consider to be different economic sectors. Furthermore, while we have relatively few textual references to potters, the remains of their workshops and industry nonetheless are common, extremely visible, and highly distinctive. The scorched kiln fragments found in excavation and the piles of discarded wasters elevated well above the natural terrain can be really quite striking. I mean, just look at that pile of Roman amphora wasters in Egypt, right? It's incredible. For Roman Greece alone, the archaeologist Eleni Hisaki has documented dozens of Roman ceramic kiln sites, and we now have a growing number of complete workshop structures that have been excavated across the region. So this is why we're focused on potters. Potters represent a group of craft workers with a particular set of characteristics. It was an activity that was extremely common, found in many communities of the ancient world, and yet highly diverse in terms of their products. They also offer a useful example for what we might describe as the textually, perhaps quiet segments of ancient society. These are groups about which we have some official documents like census data or lease contracts, and even some references to professional associations. However, we have very little in the way of personal accounts of daily life or anything approaching autobiographical descriptions. Now, this is not unique to ceramic workers. However, unlike other craft professions, we have a wonderfully rich archaeological record of pottery workshops and their products with which to investigate their daily, everyday lives. So in that sense, they are rather special. So what might these workshops look like? Well, the Roman pottery workshops that have been found are typically built in local, what I might call vernacular architectural styles. So they tend to be made according to local traditions and using construction materials typical of kind of local modest houses or kind of private residence and things like that. For example, at Petra in modern Jordan, the structures there were built of roughly hewn stones. At Pergamon and Sagalasus in Turkey, they're mud brick atop a stone foundation. At Budo and El Kab in Egypt, the structures associated with kilns are entirely of mud brick. So the workshops fit nicely in their local townscapes. In terms of organization and size, however, this could vary considerably. And while most pottery workshops seem to have been used exclusively for manufacturing, so those potters must have been living elsewhere, there is, however, occasional evidence that workshops were also houses, like the example of the Elkab workshop shown on the slide. In these house workshops, Stan Hendricks has described ostraca, which are texts written on ceramic sherds, that document the presence of a potter and his family living in the work structure. And it's thought that his sons were even potters as well. However, occasional examples of really massive production sites also exist. Outside ancient Jerusalem, there's evidence for a military kiln works. And you can see, for example, the stamp impressions with a legionary insignia, the Legio Tenfrutensis here on the slide on this tile. The workers here were made building materials and pottery for the legions. And there's even what is thought to be a possible barracks building on site, which is highlighted in blue on the plan. So ceramic workshops could vary widely in size and organization, and these represent what David Peacock would call different modes of production. Yet regardless of their organization and scale, most workshops were equipped with the means to transform clay into ceramic. That was kind of their primary business after all. Therefore, nearly all pottery workshops would have performed some sort of clay preparation, so adjusting the natural clays to a desired recipe, then forming of that clay into objects, and then finally firing them to a sintered, hardened ceramic body. These represent the very basic sequence of production, and each stage requires different technologies. However, we see many local variations and versions of these basic technologies. And I'll just briefly kind of run through a few examples just to give you a sense, really a flavor of both the technological constraints of the period, as well as some of the local variations and variety we see. For instance, preparing clays might be done by washing the clay in water, letting the heavier particles kind of settle out. And this can be done in large vessels, which we see, as well as in constructed basins, like the example from Patara on the right-hand side of the slide. Clay can also be kneaded by hand in a manner similar to kneading bread, or it could be tread with the feet. In fact, evidence of treading appears at some ancient workshops, such as the example shown on the slide here from Sagalasus. So if you look very closely, you can just make out kind of a different coloration here on the ground. And that gray-green deposit is clay that is positioned in the corner of the room. And it has a similar appearance essentially to the clay pile that you might see this gentleman kind of performing the treading exercise with. Now, wedging and treading techniques are also referenced by the ancient historian Herodotus, who in describing the exotic ways of the Egyptians, right, he's very much in the exoticizing tradition. He is, however, describing what he sees as being a sort of odd practice of wedging mud with the hands and kneading bread with the feet. Now, the accuracy of Herodotus's statements on Egyptian work practices may and should be doubted, but his assumption that the opposite scenario, hand kneading bread and foot treading earth, was somehow a correct way of doing things may be more indicative of techniques with which he was familiar, like we see at Sagalasus. Now, if we turn to wheel technologies, there are also different pottery wheels known from the workshops of the eastern provinces. In general, there is little evidence for the use of kick wheels in the Roman period. So kick wheels are kind of that traditional non-electric wheel technology that you often see in historic museums, for example. And this is where you have a top and a bottom wheel, and the bottom wheel is kicked into motion and the pottery is thrown on the upper wheel head. Now, that wheel type is thought by most people to come into prominence in the region only in the medieval period. And instead, in the Roman period, the predominant design for pottery wheels is thought to have been more akin to what are called rod-propelled types. And these are types of pottery wheels that are still used today in parts of India and Pakistan. Now, according to this design, there's one usually larger wheel head that turns on an axle and is rotated by means of a rod. And in this version, you can actually see this is an individual using one of these. It's actually currently in motion in the picture. And here is the rod, and it's essentially used to spin around the wheel, and it latches onto a notch on the top of the wheel head. Now, as you can see from the ancient evidence here, most of the images shown on the right-hand side of the slide show Roman potters at their wheels in ways that seem to be consistent with hand or rod propelled types. The example of a fresco from Pompeii is well known, and it shows a potter seated low to the ground with a wide diameter wheel head. The applique decoration on the African red slipware jug just to the right also shows a potter seated on a low stool. In this case, he's throwing from a hump. So he's throwing from a mound of clay on top of the wheel head. And the rod, if you look very closely, can be seen resting on the ground next to him. So the actual remains of wheels from workshops in the eastern provinces are relatively consistent with these depictions. For instance, at Sagalasus, several pits have been identified with surrounding lenses of clay, and those pits are thought to have been used to support a wheel head. There are also examples of what are probably slow turning turntables for trimming and decorating vessels, such as the one that's labeled B on the slide on the photo. So these two examples are nice because they also appear in the same workshop, which means that they could be used in concert and each has kind of specialized uses. Now turning to the kilns. From a technical perspective, Roman kilns have great variability in terms of construction materials and designs. And for those kiln nerds like myself, there are several well-established classifications of kiln designs for the Roman world. These include the examples by Vivian Swan and Nina Cuomo di Caprio, as well as one by Eleni Hisaki, but there are others for different regions as well. So even accounting for the variability that's present in these typologies, most Roman pottery kilns, most of them at least, are based on what are simple updraft kiln style principles. So with this type of a kiln, you have a lower combustion chamber, as you can see in this image, a lower combustion chamber for the heat and for the fire, and then there is an elevated floor on top of which would support vessels that would be stacked inside the upper chamber. So just to offer you a sense, a sort of taste of the variability of what these kilns might look like across the region, I've just quickly selected a couple well-published examples, like this one, the Amphora kilns at Demirci near Sinope on the Black Sea. These use ceramic tubular pipes as a sort of skeleton structure to support the upper firing chamber. By contrast, at another production site, the producers at Buto in Egypt also use a basic kind of beehive-shaped closed kiln design, but here the French-German research project documented some important innovations. In this case, the potters appear to have added channels into the chamber in order to allow the introduction of oxygen and better control the interior atmosphere of the kiln. This means that it would both refract heat very well, and it also could allow for the control of the color that the vessels would fire to. So these are just two simply what I would call choice examples that I selected from really hundreds of kilns documented from the region. But they give a flavor of what archaeologists would call local technological styles. So I hope this gives us, this discussion has kind of given a quick sense of what these workshop structures might look like, as well as a sense of the technological constraints in which our potters are working. Now perhaps we can begin to populate these archaeological contexts with the people of this profession. And here we can pose some other questions. Questions like, how do we see differences among workers? And can we appreciate daily life in these archaeological contexts? One place we might begin to look to enliven these workplaces is with a well-published and well-known example of a lease labor contract, such as the one that I've copied some text from here. Now, a handful of these contracts have been preserved concerning pottery workshops, mostly in rural Amphora production sites. They mostly concern those types of sites. But they nonetheless provide all sorts of details on the actors that might be involved in workshop activities. First, in this case, we observe that the workshop is in a village called Sinepta and is being leased by a potter named Aurelius Pacis. And the workshop property is owned by two women. So we can see first that workshops could be leased. So that means that those working in the shops might not own the properties themselves. Second, we can see the involvement of women in these businesses. Now, the question of women's involvement in ceramic production is one that has been much debated. And while we have very few and often contested references to women working under the title of potter in the Roman period, here at least we have an example of women as property owners working with a guardian. The other notable mention here is that the potter is able to hire additional workers that are described as having specialized roles. There are potters, there are assistants, and there are stokers for the kilns. There are specialists within Aurelius Pacis's workforce, some skilled, others less so. That even modest workshops might be populated by larger work groups is supported with some archaeological evidence. And here I'll just show you an example to demonstrate why we think this. So here is a rather what I would call small tableware workshop at Sagalasus in Turkey. Now, just to give you a sense of the scale here, each of those squares is 5 meters on a side. So in total, we're looking at a workshop that's about 30 by 50 feet. We can see, for example, here evidence of 3 potter's wheels, those pits that I showed you before, and they're in the same room. So presumably there are at least 3 throwers, as indicated by the purple rectangles. There is also a station with a turntable for trimming and finishing and possibly decorating the vessels, and that's shown with the blue circle on the plan. There are also 2 kilns indicated in red to accompany the 4 workstations. Now, this sort of parallel infrastructure is suggestive of a group with multiple workers, probably something in the order of 4, maybe 5, maybe even 6 individuals in what is a relatively small workshop. So it would have been, frankly, cozy working conditions. So the archaeological evidence seems consistent with the idea of having multiple persons as part of a working group, some of which may have had specialized roles, and some workers which might have had similar responsibilities. As was also noted in the contract, some of those in the workshop might also be assistants, so conceivably less skilled workers. And there are occasional textual references to apprentices of potters, so young people being trained on the job. There are also fingerprints that have been observed at Capharnaum in Galilee, which are small, so small that they were thought by the excavator Fanny Vito to have been made by children. Perhaps even more convincing is a fingerprint study conducted using a molded lamp from Alexandria in Egypt. The lamp is dated to the 6th and 7th centuries, and there are small fingerprints found in the inside of the lamp where the clay had been pressed into the mold in the manner kind of shown in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. Using scanning technologies, it was observed that the fingerprints did not display interpapillary lines, which are the part of the fingerprint that develops with age. Thus, the published results by Polish scholars suggested that the impressions had been made by a hand that was between 8 and 12 years old. This incidentally is very much in the age range of children described in ancient apprenticeship contracts for other trades. What is perhaps also of interest is the type of activities that these tiny fingerprints were performing. It's the attaching handles, it's pressing clay into molds. In more modern times, these are the sorts of low-skilled tasks that young apprentices are often started on in traditional pottery training. These are the baby steps, the baby tasks on which to start and from which more and more complex tasks might be learned. This means that while still training, they are also contributing to the larger production process and to the work group. This gradated learning process is what Patricia Crown calls scaffolding. Pottery production is also the type of trade that can involve really long hours of work. It's often seasonal, or at least influenced by changing seasons, which means that production is often maximized in certain months. Now, firing a kiln can last many hours, even days, depending on the furnace size and design, and depending on the types of products inside. And there are a few ancient textual references that actually do describe kiln firings running overnight, which is always nice. And it was not just a long process. Kiln firing also requires a certain degree of continual attention. If a kiln heats or cools too quickly, vessels can undergo thermal shock and break. So firing a kiln is not the type of task that you can just pick up and put down. So some of these workers would have been spending extended periods of time in the workshops. And this is perhaps evidenced by some of the investments made in those workspaces. In this workshop from Sagalasus, there was a small cooking hearth found in a corner, in one of the corners of the room. It's indicated in the kind of orange circle there. There were also several used cooking vessels that were found in the workshop floors that were not part of the products being made there, so had been brought into the workshop from outside. The hearth is the same type as found in contemporary houses in town. Now, these cooking implements and installations seem to be investments in the long working hours of these potters in their workplace. In another workshop down the street, a stack of several bowls was found stored together in one of the rooms. They all display use wear. So these are the kind of interiors that show scuffs and scrapes, right? They evidence that they were actually used. Again, possibly by the workers eating together in the workshop. Elsewhere, we also see evidence of long hours in everyday life. At a workshop near Ashkelon in Israel, which is shown on the left, used lamps were found in the access ways to the amphora kilns to provide light. And at Demirci on the Black Sea, which is shown on the right here, cooking vessels and lamps and other everyday items were found around the amphora workshops. In these deposits, the excavators also found fishing weights made of clay and likely used on site. So perhaps they were not only eating meals in this workshop, but even catching their dinners. In addition to the evidence of long hours and social life in the workplace, there is some reason to suspect that these workshops might take on additional significance for their occupants. There are examples of deceased individuals interred under the floors of Roman workshops, particularly in the Roman Northwest provinces. However, at Jerash in modern Jordan, in the remains of an earlier hippodrome, several workshops here were also found with human burials, including 2 infants buried under a door threshold. It was suggested by the excavators Antonio Ostras and Ina Kerberg that these were interred while the hippodrome workshops were active, and that they may represent internments of the community of craft workers. As regards funerary activity at the production site of Buto in Egypt, there was another example of burials associated with a production context, in this case, a kiln. In early excavations conducted by a British project in the 1960s and 70s, a 2nd century BC kiln was found. It lacked an elevated floor, so it was missing the floor. It was large enough to be entered and had been renovated but not fired. It was an unusual kiln even in the area. In 12 wedge-shaped niches cut into the wall of the kiln were placed 12 disarticulated skulls. It was described in publication as a, quote, family mausoleum. And the funerary site was maintained while nearby kilns continued to be used for production. Now, the meaning of such remains is really difficult to understand, and it's very difficult to interpret. In some cases, perhaps these workshops very well might have hosted multi-generational family businesses, and they might also have become focal points for the potting and craft community. Or they may just simply have presented convenient places to inter the dead, often on the outskirts of town and often in proximity to existing necropoli. However, at Kfar Nahaf in Galilee, the situation is slightly different. Here, the humerus, so an arm bone of a young person, was found in a groove carved into the stone threshold of the kiln. And it was thought by the excavator Fenivito perhaps to have been placed there as some sort of foundation rite to protect the kiln during firing. This interpretation draws on other bodies of evidence that suggest that the kiln within the pottery workshop was seen as being somehow ritually charged, if we're going to use sort of pun. Certainly, the firing of a kiln comes with pragmatic risks and costs that differ from other types of potting technology. Once filled, sealed, and lit, the potter is to a certain extent, at least, at the mercy of the kiln firing, right? It's very difficult to drastically or dramatically alter the process. It all has to be done very gradually. This means that even in well-regulated events, most firings result in some degree of misfires even today. 5 to 10% vessel loss has been documented ethnographically using the sorts of updraft kilns used in antiquity. So therefore, even with experienced professional potters, firing loss was common. And this is always attested really by the heaps of wasters found at so many production sites. Even small dumps like this one that you can see as in section from Sagalasus, even a small dump like this one will contain many thousands of vessel rejects. So the numbers can be really quite staggering. Now, this process was economically risky, but perhaps it was also risky in other ways. The ancient writer Pliny reports that pottery was thought to be especially susceptible to the effects of curses. And the well-known Pseudo-Herodotean poem is often cited as evidence of superstition and magic associated with ceramic production. Now, there is some discussion on the dating of this poem, which is sometimes referred to as the Kiln or the Potter's Hymn. Most agree that it's a pastiche, at least, of 2, maybe 3 earlier, probably 6th or 5th century kiln curses with some Hellenistic and Roman period additions. So it seems like it had a later life as well. John Gager proposes that such curses may have been composed by competing potters, reflecting a sort of professional rivalry or animus played out through the kiln firing. Now, the details are what are so wonderful about this poem, because it describes things like demons or gremlins of the kiln with names that translated to terms like smasher or cracker or shake to pieces. And it describes the kilns grinding the pots to powder as grinds the horse's jaws. It references spirits breaking vessels and even kilns during the firing, such that potters may wail as they see the mischief. Similar concerns might be expressed in later times also. In late antique Antioch, textual sources describe images of Saint Simeon the Stylate placed outside of craft workshops for protection. Archaeologically, in pottery workshops, use of Christian symbols such as crosses on tools and kiln furniture have been observed and reflect not only probably the religious identity of the potters, but these inscribed symbols may also have apotropaic associations. So here are some examples at Demirci on the Black Sea. You can see an example on the left here of crosses inscribed in vessel stands. Some of these were probably also used in the kiln. The Christian symbols also appear on a range of tools at Sagalasus. Two examples are here on the right. These are also, crosses and these types of symbols. And you can see the funnel here in the middle and a scraper tool on the right. So in my last few minutes this afternoon, I would like to take the opportunity to present a more focused case study of a production center, the so-called Potter's Quarter of Sagalasus. This is a site where I worked for several years studying the pottery workshops and material culture of potters with the Sagalasus Archaeological Research Project, which is based at the University of Leuven in Belgium. I want to examine this particular site not only because I'm well familiar with it, but because much of what we've discussed thus far really concerns the happenings and the social experiences within the workshop itself. So we've been rather constrained in these workshop contexts. However, as we saw in discussing professional associations at the start of the talk, social relations might extend well beyond the workshop and into wider communities. So in the next few slides, we'll focus on some other questions about the social side of work in a place like Sagalasus. Questions like, how are workshops placed within the urban environment? And how did potters engage with such an urban setting? Now, just to quickly introduce the site, here is Sagalasus. It is situated in the Western Taurus Mountains of Southwest Turkey, and it has many of the Roman monuments just typical of an urban center of this status in the region. So it's got the Bouleuterian for political meetings. It's got the entertainment buildings like a theater and a stadium. It has commercial spaces like the Agora, McKellum, and streets lined with shops. However, what is of particular interest for today is an area just on the outskirts of the city in the eastern suburbs. So this area was situated just above a major cart road into town, which would have witnessed, of course, the movement of clay and fuel to the workshops. And like many pottery production centers of the era, it was in proximity to a necropolis. In this case, workshops might even abut tombs, so they were in close neighbors. Now, this cluster of workshops was situated both outside and out of sight of the city. So here, if you look, there's a slight depression here. This is the area where the workshops are primarily concentrated. And if you look, there is this kind of natural ridge in the topography, which blocks view of those workshops from the downtown area. It was also downwind of the downtown area. And the suburban location, of course, speaks to the pottery industry's relationship with the wider urban populace. Indeed, certain ancient treatises, such as the one written by Julian of Ashkelon, outline guidance on building distances from industry furnaces. So these express explicit concerns about fire and smoke. So the establishment of these workshops in the eastern suburbs seems in keeping with wider ancient attitudes and norms for pyrotechnological industries. Yet this area also hosted what was a major regional center of production and an important feature of the local economy. The workshops of Sagalasus manufactured tablewares. So think here, cups and bowls and plates and platters, those types of things. And it manufactured those ceramics for 7 centuries. So to put that in human terms, or more human terms, that's somewhere in the order of 25 generations of potters. So this industry was a long-running feature of the local community and the local economy. Now, if we look here, and the image on the right in particular, you can see a rendering of the geophysical survey conducted over the area. These results show the presence of subterranean, so unexcavated archaeological features that have been detected electromagnetically. On the plan, you can see just how densely this workshop area would have been occupied. You can see lines, these darker kind of purple lines where there are workshop walls, and occasionally you can see where there are roads running between them. There are also an estimated 80 to 120 red dots shown on this image. So if you look, you can see these little red dots. Now, every excavation in the vicinity of one of those red dots has yielded a pottery kiln. So you can get an impression from this, just the density of workshops in this neighborhood. So this one single workshop, which has been excavated, we've already talked about a little bit when we were talking about the cooking hearth, right, that we found there. However, this workshop was also part of a bigger complex. It had neighbors, and some very close neighbors. As you can see on the plan, workshop 1 is part of a complex of at least 3 other workshops. They're not fully, the whole area isn't fully excavated, but we can kind of extrapolate between the geophysics and what has been excavated in them. And there is potential evidence here of neighbors working together. Most notably, there's reason to suspect the potters that were working here might have shared tools, particularly tools that are frankly kind of difficult to come by, like decorative figural stamps, like this one. So these stamps are each individually carved and sculpted from clay. And then once they're fired, you can use them to impress on molds and vessels and to transfer that decoration. In comparing the stamps and impressions of those stamps, we can see that there are many matches actually between remains found on the workshop floors. So we can see that there seems to be some sort of collaboration taking place between the potters. So workshops are not just working in isolation. And in cases where we have professional neighbors that are so close, they might even interact. Stamps are just one type of tool used in these workshops, though, and the full collection of tools found in the workshops provide different views onto the lives of their potters. The toolkits collectively really represent the wider material world in which these potters are living. So Sagalasus is, of course, as we said, a considerable city in the region. So its material culture reflected its status and access to wider material goods. In looking at the tools here, the potting tools, the potters are clearly seeing objects and then bringing them into the workshop and adapting them for work purposes. It's really kind of a great way in which you can see how they're thinking about how their trade is situated and things that can be brought in for everyday use. Just to give you a sense of what these look like, so here labeled A, we see pebbles that are taken from river systems several kilometers down in the valley, brought up and being used as polishers. So this is a little river pebble, and as you can see, there's a flattened surface where it has received work or received erosion. We see hairpins that are normally used to hold women's hairdos in place, like the object marked F, but here they're being used to inscribe and cut clay. We see a piece of a bronze inscription recut into a scraper, like in letter C. We see fragments of marble revetment that normally would appear on the walls of buildings being broken off and used as grinding pallets, like the letter E. These potters are clearly part of that Sagalasus urban world, and they brought that material world into their professional lives. In addition to adapting items as tools, we also see tools that are fashioned from clay or reused from sherds. They were likely made in the workshops by the very people who use them. The most common type that we see are the potter's ribs. So this is a type of scraper tool. In fact, all of the objects on this slide are potter's ribs. So they are all the same type of tool. However, as you can see, there's quite a bit of variability in their shape, and with different edges designed to make different pottery shapes. Some are more rounded, others more angular. One example even nicely corresponds to this very distinctive interior shape of a platter. Some tools are even inscribed with names, indicating the private property of individual potters. This example marked F on the image preserved what's thought to be part of the name Solon, a name that incidentally also appears more widely in the region of Pisidia and even on some local Sagalasus tombstones. So it may have just been a common name in the city. So this sort of evidence from the pottery workshops at Sagalasus offers amazing details about everyday working lives in the Roman town. The workshops may have been located downwind and in the suburbs, and thus spatially separated, but the remains left by more than 25 generations of potters do not give the impression of a group working on the social margins of their urban community. Quite the opposite. They had their own neighborly relations. They used items they picked up in town for their work. They may have even had common local names like Solon. Now, as I'm certainly running out of time, I should probably conclude. But before doing so, I would like to quickly revisit and return to some of the ideas that I laid out at the start of the talk concerning the place of work in framing and structuring everyday life. Now, what we know of the social lives of professional crafts and tradespeople demonstrates the importance of professional identities in the Roman world. And while potters were among dozens of crafts and trades known from the period, the particularities of their remains means that we can capture some remarkable insights into daily life of this wonderfully common occupation and what it might have been like. Workshops were hubs of social and economic activity. There might be women owners to the property. Children might be training on the job. Long days might be spent operating the kiln and meals shared. Certain stages of the production might present risks and anxiety, and rivals might curse each other. These are the details that enliven the daily lives and social experiences of ancient workplaces. And to return to the words of Applebaum, it's the way that we can reconstruct how, quote, how work structures the way people live and how they make contact with their material and social reality. So in taking a closer look at our potters, I hope this talk has provided some meaningful views into the world, the big world of ancient work and labor. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that really fruitful discussion, Elizabeth. We have many questions that have been pouring in over the length of your talk here. So I do want to get to as many of these as we can before we have to wrap up.
Sure.
So first question came in before we even started. So I really want to let this person ask their question. And that is, I want to ask this question for years. The firing of all that pottery must have taken an incredible amount of wood. Has there been any research on how that impacted the environment and possible deforestation of the Mediterranean area?
Yeah, these are fantastic questions, actually. And, you know, it really depends on the regions where these potters are working. There is evidence for what I might call creative use of fuels that we can see in certain workshops. In some workshops, that's clear that they're using the pressing remains from olive oil. So it's called pomace, and it's this, you know, the remains that are left over after oil pressing. And so there are instances in which it seems like they're not just all using hard woods. Elsewhere, especially in kind of arid regions, there's evidence of using smaller brush, of using even grasses and these types of fuels. Elsewhere, however, there would have been kind of impacts, I think, on local, particularly forests and things like that. What often is difficult, however, to disarticulate is how much of the impact is the local industry versus clearance for other purposes. And so kind of disentangling the direct impacts of potters and industry on the type of environment and raw materials, the fuel resources, is difficult to do. But what I will say is that there are tweaks that we see in some locations to the kiln designs so that they seem to be able to radiate and sustain more heat. We see the use of agricultural trimmings, agricultural clippings, these kind of other ways. They're very creative in what they're using, especially when they don't have really great resources, sustainable resources. They're clearly, able to sustain pottery production in places like Egypt for a long period of time. So they're clever in how they choose their fuels for these purposes.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so next question. What is the biggest technological advancement in pottery creation and from what time period?
That's a great question. It depends on what you're looking for in terms of advancement. I suppose is the answer. Ceramics is such a versatile material, and it's used for so many things in the ancient world. So technological tricks and tweaks to designs of pottery, of the development, even an expanded use of glazes, for example, they all have particular kind of applications. So it really depends on which type of ceramic we're talking about. This is one of the glorious things about ceramics, is it's just such a versatile material. Those images I showed you before showed just how many different types of things today are lots of different materials, plastics, cheap glass, cheap aluminum types of things like that. But ceramic covered a lot of these types of material classes and functions. So it really is dependent on the specifics of the question.
All right, so next question. How did the potters keep the prepared clay damp before using it?
This is a very good question. So in that one area where I showed you at Sagalasus, where we have evidence that it's sitting on the ground, probably left over from the treading exercise, there was actually a large water container in the corner. So presumably they would have been kind of adjusting the recipe as it was being doled out to the potters that were using it. Elsewhere, at places like Patara with those big, that big basin, there is a water feature to that. And so they were connected in some cases. Some of these workshops were actually connected into the water lines for the city. There were distribution points in those parts of town. So they would have been, using kind of, using their supplies and keeping the clays wet. There's probably also other tricks that we don't pick up because archaeologically we just don't have them, but you can lay out wet textile over the top and also kind of keep them moist for longer periods of time. But that's really difficult to pick up archaeologically because it just usually doesn't preserve.
Great. Okay, so I have a question from Anna-Olga Kolaski-Ostro. So she's working on a book on the topic. So
yes,
preface by saying that. So she says, hello, Dr. Murphy. Thank you for your fantastic study and talk. I wonder if you can say anything about how attractive it would have been to have your house located right next to a potter shop. Would the inhabitants notice the noise and smells from baking the ceramics? And would those be desirable or have a strong negative to the location of one's home? So she's thinking, along the lines of today, not wanting to live next to factories. And again, this is in the context of her upcoming book. So if you give any opinion on your desirability of proximity to such shops would be of great interest to her.
Yes, this is a great question, and it's one that I've been thinking about quite a bit as well, because there are instances of workshops that seem to be also houses, right? So they're kind of integrated structures. Typically, what I've been kind of tracing out, I would say, is that when you have this combination of domestic space with workspace, they're often separated somewhat, like not necessarily spatially, but you have a cluster of rooms that seems to be domestic in nature and a cluster of rooms that seems to be work in nature. And in some of those cases, it looks like maybe the kilns are positioned outside of town, so separate from the workshop structure itself. So we have to be, I think, a little bit more flexible in how we think about the spaces, because just because it has doesn't have a kiln doesn't necessarily make it a workshop, or doesn't necessarily not make it a workshop. So there is a kind of different ways of thinking about spatial organization of these cases. Most of the ones, I think part of the reason why we don't see a lot of pottery workshops also as houses is because of some of these issues with smoke, with regular firing. It's not always, it depends a bit on the fuel, because some fuels will produce less smoke. But certainly that's not a great neighbor. And I think that's why we see so many of these on the outskirts of town, in the area of necropoli, that are also kind of segmented away from the main town. It's not necessarily that they're so socially marginalized, but that there are kind of pragmatic reasons why you don't want to live next to a potter's kiln. It's not 100% though. Some people are, but most are not.
Okay, a question here about lease agreements. So with regards to the lease agreement, what proportion of the annual production would the lease rental have been?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
So this individual wants to know, what proportion of the annual production would the lease rental have been?
It's difficult to say. So it's essentially a sort of lease labor combined contract. So my understanding of how they work, and I'm not a legal historian, but my understanding of how they work is that you rent a space and then you have a certain agreement in these cases, because many of them are amphora production. So they are within a set period of time, you produce a set number of vessels. And the agreements are great. They offer all sorts of really interesting details, like that the owner of the property sometimes supplies the clays. And so the potter's not responsible for running around finding clays or anything like that. They're supplied those types of materials. And then within a set period of time, in anticipation, presumably, of the harvest, when they would be used as containers, then you have a certain number that are available. So it's a kind of combined package of both.
Okay, I've got a different question here about qualities of clay. So does the quality of clay differ from site to site? Were the workshops more likely to be found near good sources of suitable clay?
Wow, that's a very good question. These are all excellent questions, actually. So clays vary, of course, in terms of their suitability, in terms of their plasticity, in terms of their natural levels of inclusions, things like that. So every clay will need kind of its own tweaking. I can speak most kind of extensively about the examples from Sagalasus, because I know those a little bit more in depth. But for example, at Sagalasus, we're able to identify that the sources of those clays are coming quite a long distance. So in this case, they're traversing almost 7 or 8 kilometers into the valley system. That is not a normal situation, and it probably is tied to different kind of landholding practices, earlier landholding practices in the area. But even there, there are still extraction points for using those clays to make tile and brick for modern purposes. But the modern tile and brick is actually using a different layer of the clays than that used for the Roman period. And the Roman period extraction zone, so you have multiple layers of clay, and one in particular is what's being extracted for the Roman potters, which means they were targeting that particular layer, that particular bed of clay, even within a bigger sequence of different types of clay. So the Roman potters were actually using better quality clays than they are currently in the modern production site.
All right, sorry, my baby's crying in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear that. I've got a question, one that asks you to plug the name of your recent book. So thank you for your lecture. I was wondering what the name of your upcoming book is and when it's going to be published. Oh, we never asked. But also, when does she think the use of women hairpins in pottery workshops helps to strengthen the argument of women potters in antiquity?
Yes, so I'm still finalizing. The book is going to go in, as I tell my chair, any day now, and I keep tweaking the title. My husband's insistent on crafting Imperium, but I keep telling him I'm pretty sure there's a book by that name. So, and anyways, I'm hoping to get it in, and so yes, it should be in the next hopefully few weeks. As regards the hairpins is lovely, right? Because for years and years, we were at Sagalasus, it was being identified that this part of the town was just producing a surprising number of women's hairpins. And so the hypothesis for a while was that maybe these are all women potters. But in fact, what we can say is that like needles, like styluses, like hairpins, they're being used for tools. You can actually see see that they're actually like the widths of the stylus ends, the widths of these points corresponds, because the hairpins actually tend to be smaller than needles or styluses. So you can actually see how they're being used in the workshops. Maybe they're women. It's hard to imagine that in some of these cases, especially where you have this close relationship between the household and the workshop, that women aren't somehow involved, right? That this isn't some sort of a family, everybody partakes in various points of the production process. It's hard to imagine that women weren't in some way involved. The issue is that we just don't have them taking the title of potter. We don't have that as clear reference. But they probably, it's hard to imagine that they weren't somehow associated with the production process, especially when these families seem to be so closely tied to the production in some cases.
Great. And we actually have time for one last question. And so this one asks, is there evidence that artisans in these shops were making figural or sculptural work in clay alongside pots and utilitarian ware, or were these kinds of workshops kept separate?
That's a really good question. The idea of specialization is really, there aren't any clear-cut answers that I've been able to come up with. In the cases where we have workshops and we can associate a sort of specialization with them, not many of them are kind of large-scale sculptural workshops for the Roman period. I've yet to come across, but if anybody knows of one, please let me know. I'm always open. please let me know if I'm missing one. But we don't have a lot of evidence for the sorts of like larger scale sculptural production in the Eastern Med during these periods. We do have, however, lots of appliques, which are decorative and sometimes figural decorative that would then be applied to pots. We also have a lot of molded wares in the late antique periods, in which you have a lot of stamping going on and kind of the recombinations of different stamps and different types of organization, like in different types of representations. In terms of specialization, it's tricky to say because there are instances in which workshops, at least at Sagalasus, where they do seem to be much more kind of specialized in decorative wares. So not just the pots and the plates and the bowls and things, but some that are specifically making figurines, some that are making molded vessels, things like that. But it's not 100%. That's the case at Sagalasus. And if you go to a different production site, sometimes you see a different type of mixing in terms of specialization, where maybe they're doing both. It's very difficult. It really is almost like on a case-by-case basis from what I've been able to pick up. But if anybody knows of anything more specific, please reach out. I'd much appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking time to answer all of these really wonderful and thoughtful questions. And Dr. Murphy, just what a wonderful presentation. We're so thankful that you could join us here today and give this great talk on potters. I really learned a lot. And just one more plug for the AIA. If you're not already a member, please do consider joining, and you can hear more lectures like this fabulous one we just heard from Dr. Murphy at your local lectures through the 100+ societies we have all over North America. And if you're a society officer, please don't forget that in about 20 minutes, we will have our society happy hour where we will hear some really wonderful presentations from our local AIA society officers. We'll have a chance to network and just really thank you and congratulate you all for another year sort of well done. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.